connection with everyone and, really provide access and the best education to students in India and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for making a great presentation. And we also offer the US High School Diploma to Indian students from grade 9 to 12 here in India. And many students are registered and many will be registering in next session. So it offers a very flexible timing to learn, to earn the US High School Diploma based in India only. I'm sure that many schools will offering this program to their students. So thank you, Angela. So our next speaker is Chandrika Bahadur. She is the director of SDG Academy, United Nations Sustainable Development Solution Network. And she is a great educator and focused on sustainability and works worldwide and leading an SDG Academy in the world. So I welcome Dr. Chandrika to share your views.
Thank you, Ravitji, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I will spend maybe. Do we have question and answers?
We may have, if time permits, here.
Okay. So I will try and keep my presentation short so we can have some question and answers around this. I represent the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is an organization that is been set up to help institutes of education particularly achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of context as to why we are working in this area and why we think this is important. So the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of you may have heard of, are the global framework that were adopted at the United Nations in 2015. If you look at these goals, they basically cover a range of issues around economic issues, so reduction of poverty, creation of jobs, economic growth, industrial growth. So there's a whole set of economic objectives which are basically focused on helping people live more prosperous lives, earn more money, live a better live a better life for themselves and for their families. Then there is a set of goals which focus on what people really need: health, education, human rights, uh, freedom from hunger. So the basic needs that people that build people's capabilities are the second set of goals. And then the third set of goals, which are critical, are around how we live in the planet. So around clean energy, around climate change, around protecting our ecosystems on land, protecting our ecosystems on water. And as you can imagine, each of these elements is fairly complicated in itself, but also very closely linked to each other. Now, within this, of particular importance, I think, for just my own work is SDG 4, right, which is the goal that focuses on education. And if you look at the title of the goal, it basically, the wording says to ensure inclusive and equitable education, sorry, to equitable education, quality of education, and promote lifelong learning for all. So the idea of the goal itself is a recognition of two things. One, when children are in school, there is a certain quality of education that we expect as students, as parents, as consumers of the education system. But the second, equally important recognition, and I think this is also something that the previous presentation on ASU highlights, is that learning is now flexible and learning does not happen within the classroom only. In fact, many would argue that there is much greater learning outside of the classroom and beyond the classroom. So when people graduate from college, when they take up their jobs, it doesn't mean that learning stops, it actually continues. Now, within the Sustainable Development Goals, there are targets and indicators for different goals. And I want to particularly draw your attention to target 4.7. So this is the seventh target under the education goal. And the reason this is important is because it puts together all of the rationale for why we care about sustainable education. So what it says is that by 2030, this is what the target says, ensure that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among other things, education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. So if you look at this, it's a very broad, but it's a very dense formulation of what exactly we are talking about when we are talking about quality education. And this is going beyond the traditional subjects of languages and mathematics and science and social science. So if we unpack this particular target, what are the elements? What are we talking about? When we say education for sustainable development, what do we mean? So under education for sustainable development, there are four broad themes that I want to highlight. The first is understanding what these goals are, not so much as knowing the goals per se, but understanding what are the concepts behind them. Why is it important to reduce poverty, for example? Why is it important to have health for all? And particularly when we are faced with the kind of situation that the world is in today, 1 year into a global pandemic, these questions become very important. What is the importance of the individual goal? So that's the first element of what teaching about sustainable education would be. The second element is helping our young people to understand how these goals are connected to each other. So if I care about climate change, why should I care about COVID-19, right? This is a question that is, it's a complicated question, but it's one that young people should be trained to think about how to look at the interlinkages between some of these very important and very immediate phenomena which are affecting them. The third is, what can I do about it, right? So I am a student, I am in a school. How will I help achieve these goals? What needs to happen at my individual action level? What needs to happen at my community? What needs to happen in my country? And what needs to happen amongst with all countries in the world? So understanding what the differences of action are. So for example, if I say we will not use plastic straws, right? I pledge today that I will never use a plastic straw because I have read in my textbooks that when plastic goes into the sea, it affects marine life and it endangers marine life. I need to understand how my individual action matters, how that is compounded when that action is replicated in the community, and what are some of the big steps that governments have to take that are independent of this action. So understanding that is important. And the final reason why this is important is because we want to recognize and respect, and want our young people to recognize and respect what our relationship with the natural world actually is. Most of the world's children today are studying in cities, right? Urban education now is a greater proportion than rural education of the total student population in the world. When you're living in a city, you tend to lose touch with the natural world. You don't really understand why forests matter. There are many children that have never visited a forest, that have never seen the natural environment. We need to have an education that actually helps them understand what the role is of the planet, of the natural ecosystems in our life. So that's one element of education for sustainable development. There is a second element which Target 4.7 captures, which is global, what we call global citizenship education. Now, this is more about the values and the norms that we recognize are critical for us to be good citizens of where we live, of our community, of our country, and of the world. So I've listed out four elements here that are highlighted in the discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals. Human rights. So every human being having a set of basic minimum rights. Gender equality, how men are treated, how women are treated in societies, how third genders are treated in society. How does all that come together in a way that is cohesive and fair? Peace and nonviolence, which I think is India's great gift to the formulation here of what matters in a global citizenship. And culture, which is the recognition that different cultures have enormous amounts of value to add to what we know about the world, how we understand the world, how we interpret the world. And so not just knowing our own culture, but knowing the role that culture has played in other societies so that we understand better where other people are coming from. So the third element here is what I would broadly define as 21st century skills. Now, this is not so much on the content of the what, But this is really how are we training our minds to think? And this is critical, and I'll come back to why it's critical. But there are three elements to this. One is, can young people analyze problems? Can they understand? Can they see a problem, break it down, not look for answers, but look for how they're going to work through disentangling that problem, breaking it down into smaller components, and finally being able to solve it? Are they critical thinkers? Do they question what they are told? Do they take it at face value, or are they taught systematically to critique and to have criteria for how they decide whether something that's being told to them makes sense or not? And the third, can they problem solve? Do they, when they get a problem, when they get stuck somewhere, do they know how to work their way out? So those are three cognitive skills that are part of any kind of work environment that we're going to see in the future. Then the second set of skills is, how do we work with people? Do we reward initiative? Do we cultivate leadership in children? Are we asking them to take responsibility for things that are going on in their lives so that they get used to being leaders? Do we encourage teamwork? Are we systematically equipping them with the tools that they need to be better team workers, to allocate tasks, to discuss problems, to delegate? And third, are we teaching them to collaborate? Are we teaching them to reach out to other groups and work with those groups when they need to solve a problem? And the final element of 21st century skills is around communication. Can they write well? Can they speak well? When they have a thought, can they express it in a cogent way? The reason 21st century skills are important is because as we are moving forward, the kind of jobs that students will have to do, the kind of problems that they will have to solve, are not problems that necessarily are present or visible to us right now. So we cannot help them, we cannot train them anymore to solve set problems, but we can help them be able to understand how to solve a problem. And that's really where the 21st century skills come in. Now, who are we and what role do we play in this? So I represent the SDG Academy. We are an online learning initiative, and our aim is to prepare young people to be leaders of sustainable development around the world. So our aim is that when you're in school, the issues that I've just been talking about, the issues of sustainable development, become so intrinsic to you as a person that as you are growing up, you are a natural leader in this space. We want to bring the best minds together from around the world to teach sustainable development, but then to also foster a global dialogue on this. One of our big objectives is to build a global student cohort. So when we run a course, we typically have students from 190 countries. Now, why is that important? It's important because students learn while they are studying with us that there are actually different problems faced by people at different parts of the world, or in different parts of the world, people look at the same problem in many different ways. And that's important because it gives them a texture, it gives them an added set of information in which they start thinking of the problem differently once they talk about people from very different backgrounds. And the fourth thing that we do is we focus unequivocally on science, on evidence, and knowledge. So we are not in the business of creating educational content where people's opinions are codified as the content. We rely very much on what we know from science and the evidence base that exists. So that is our objective. What you see here is a little snapshot of the kinds of courses that we create. Everything is free, everything is online, everything is available for anyone to use. So this is just a quick idea of and if you look at this slide, you'll see that there is every topic that you can imagine covered. And that's the beauty of the sustainable goals, because it allows you to actually cut across a very wide range. So it's not just environmental courses, but there are courses on education, on human rights, on health, so a whole range of issues to deal with. Where have we gotten so far? We have about over 500,000, 6 lakh plus learners. We have learners from all countries in the world. We have about 32 full-time courses and several more in the pipeline. Again, where do our learners come from? As you can see, we still have a little bit of a bias of learners from high-income countries. This is a little bit because technology is still not democratically spread across the world. So access is easier in countries that are high income. But you'll see that we have more students from lower middle income countries than upper middle income countries. And I think India has a large role to play in that because we have a lot of students from India. The geographic breakdown, of course, is again fairly variable, but with most of the countries coming in from Europe and Central Asia. Our courses are in English, so most of our speakers are native English speakers, but we, as you can see, we have lots of other languages represented as well. We have a slight edge in terms of more women than men, but that's almost equal. And most of our students have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. So we cater to higher education students, but we have an increasing share of high school students. So it's very interesting for us to see younger people take our courses, and they're able to do it quite easily, which means that the material translates well across levels of education. This is the free resource I was talking about. We have an academy, we have a library which basically takes all of our courses and takes every individual video of the course and uploads it, and you can search by language, as you can see, by video, by lecturer, by SDG, by subject. And here we have users from about 188 countries. So this is a resource primarily directed towards teachers, because it's teachers who search for content that might be useful to them and then put it together in the way that they would want to use it. Now, I want to finally as I said, I wanted to keep the presentation itself short. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about why this matters. Now, why are we so focused on education for sustainable development? There are four reasons. One is this generation that's currently in school is going to be in the peak of their workforce when several of our planetary boundaries are breached in terms of carbon dioxide in the air, in terms of nitrous oxide, in terms of deforestation. So this is the generation that will really have to learn how to live in harmony with nature. Previous generations have disregarded nature and gotten us to the point where we are now, but the responsibility will fall on the current generation. The second reason it's so important for us is we want to make sure that everybody is learning the same facts. And this is important because unless there is a common understanding and a common vocabulary of what are these threats that we are facing, we will not be able to take the first step towards solutions. And the field of climate change is a great example of this. For a long time, particularly in the United States, there's been a lot of opposition to climate change because the facts were being questioned, whether or not climate change is happening, whether or not it is caused by human activity. And what we want to do is to make sure at least everybody shares the facts. Then you can argue on interpretation and you can argue on what the solution needs to be. We want to focus on learning empathy and kinship. This is a very important part of the SDGs for us because, in our worldview, it's a small planet. There may be 7.7 billion people on it, but humanity as a whole is affected by actions that any individual takes. So it's not helpful to think of ourselves as citizens only of our country or of a state or religion, but really as humanity as a whole. And finally, we need to help young people learn to solve very complicated problems of the kind that maybe didn't exist half a century ago. And there are no simple answers to these problems. So the better skills we're able to inculcate from an early age, the better chance they have of solving these problems. And why does it matter right now, today? So the first reason for that is COVID-19. When we come out of COVID-19, we will have a range of problems to solve which are very, very different from what we had even a year ago. We need to manage living with a pandemic even after hopefully the pandemic is over. We need to make sure things like this don't happen again. So we will need a new way of thinking to attack these problems. News and social media today is having a huge impact on how young people think. And again, this is a reason why making sure that we all have access to the same set of information and then draw our conclusions is very important. As I mentioned earlier, work is changing, and so people are not going to be prepared for low skill routine jobs. We have to help leapfrog and create a workforce that is smart, flexible, adaptable, and problem solving. And finally, across the world, traditional cultures and values are vanishing. And there is so much to learn from what our ancestors knew and learned, particularly in terms of their relationship with nature, and take what is good in that as we move forward. So I hope you join us on this journey, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And thank you again,